stirred up last night is you were invited to think about various ways you've experienced loss. Maybe you have been wrestling with what that looks like for God to be a midwife in your life, telling you that maybe it's time to push and that you are made for this, right? To be a feisty God with tender strength, inviting you into what as you move from why. And so this morning, as we come together, I want to just invite us to take a moment to pause and orient ourselves to this day and this morning. I know it's a lot to check out of a room first thing in the morning, and so even that may have, taken you for a moment out of this more reflective place. So I want to just invite us to center down this morning, right? So if you would, just close your eyes. I invite you to take just a really good breath in and a good breath out. Do that a couple of times. Allow yourself to root down into your chair and even welcome your body as it seeks to get present here this morning. Graciously, gently notice your thoughts this morning. However random, maybe they're racing. Notice your feelings. Notice what you hold in your body. And gently, kindly welcome it all. Welcome. I want to invite you now to silently pray with me this breath prayer. On the inhale, we'll pray, bright morning star. And on the exhale, we begin this day with you. So as you take a breath in, bright morning star. And as you breathe out, we begin this day with you. Bright morning star. We begin this day with you. Bright morning star. We begin this day with you. In Jesus' name we pray. A couple of thoughts from last night before we turn the corner into the strangely wrapped gift for this morning. One of the things that I want to acknowledge is that as we embrace the strangely wrapped gift of learning how to journey with our grief like we talked about, I think helpful language around that is that we understand there are multiple laps. that sometimes when we're struck with grief, maybe something new happens and maybe we're reminded of old grief and we think, I really thought I had grieved that. Where is this coming from? That we are gentle and kind, we are an empathetic witness, like we said, and that in that way we acknowledge maybe there's another lap of grief that we are being invited into. And we get as many laps as we need. But the important piece is that we don't invalidate the grief work that we've already done previously. It doesn't mean it wasn't good enough. It doesn't mean it wasn't thorough. What it may mean is that we're reminded of another way this loss has impacted us. And sometimes it's not until years down the road that we realize another way a loss has impacted us. And so as we are attuning to what it is that we're aware of in the grief and the sadness, or the snark, the bitterness, the emptiness, the withdrawal, any of those things that are coming up in us, we can acknowledge, hey, there's another lap here, right? The other thing that I want to share, Karen shared this with me, and I thought this was so meaningful. We talked about, with this idea of grief, that on into this resurrection phase, that we can experience God as midwife. And Karen said she had the realization that when we are aware of a death, whatever kind of death that is, whether it's someone that we have lost, or something that has died, or something that needs to die in us, that maybe we can also experience God as hospice worker. Isn't that interesting, right? If you've ever been around a hospice worker, or maybe some of you have, been in...
They call them death doulas.
Death doulas. Isn't that interesting, right? Like helping a person navigate that. I know when my father died, the death doula was a really important part of that process, both for him and for my brother and me. And so there is all kinds of freedom, is there not, for us to understand God in new ways. That's part of the beauty of what I was saying last night, is that if we allow it, grief will often invite us into more richer, fuller understandings of who God is. And so just ponder that. And Karen, thank you for that observation. Well, I want to begin by telling you a story this morning. And I shared last night that as a part of what I do professionally, I lead a lot of support groups. And so one particular support group that I was leading was full of spouses that had experienced some painful things in their marriage, and were also working on their marriage. But there was a gal, we'll call her Susan, who is in this particular group, and even though they had made a lot of progress, her husband was living in sobriety and freedom, their marriage wasn't what she had imagined it might be. And she was sort of stomping around about that emotionally. You ever stomp around emotionally? Like, no, this is not what I want, right? She had stomped around for a few months. And we had held space for that lament for her, that there were just some places where they would rub up against each other in their false selves that wasn't pleasant for either one of them. Well, one morning we were in group, and Susan was, lamenting this and just saying, why is this the case? And then almost in mid-sentence, she kind of sat back in her chair and she said, you know what? What if in this marriage we can continue to work on things and we can continue to grow? But maybe what's true is that there might always be some challenge. That that's just how it is with the two of us. We love each other. We're for each other. We can keep growing. And maybe what's true is that there might be some places in our marriage that might just be difficult. We watched an internal shift become an external shift. We watched it. We all knew we were on holy ground that morning. Because what Susan did was to welcome what is. See, when we're using the energy to fight against it, right? Like, no, this is not what I want. It keeps us from welcoming what is in fact true. Now, I'm not suggesting that we celebrate, yay, there are going to be parts of my marriage that are challenging. What's also true is that we're using our energy differently, right? And that becomes a whole different internal shift. What I find so often with loss is that there is this push against wanting to acknowledge this is the reality. So the strangely wrapped gift is that we learn to welcome what is. Now, let's talk about what this isn't, okay? So you see here on the handout, there's a couple of things that this is not, and I think this is really important by definition that we're clarifying. This is not throwing our hands in the air like a victim mentality. I had a friend who would often say, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And that was the spirit of, there's really nothing I can do about this. And there is some victiminess in that. This isn't acquiescence, where we reluctantly accept something without voicing our dissent. This is so important. This is not forgiving, right? That's cheap forgiveness. And we cheaply forgive for so many reasons, you guys. Whether there's been a bully pulpit that has, told us that's what we have to do. We believe that's the right thing to do. Of course, forgiveness is transformational and holy. And if it's cheap, it means we've rushed it, right? We've not really done our forgiveness work in that process. And so welcoming isn't, quote, forgiving and being too codependent to hold a boundary, right? Or to say no to abuse. And it's not, like we talked about last night, it's not a spiritual bypass, right? Remember this, I might as well just draw this again because I keep referring to it. All right, if this is death, burial, and resurrection, this is not welcoming, right? Where we build the bridge to avoid doing that work. And that's so important that we acknowledge that's not what this is. All right, so what is welcoming? Well, welcoming is when we are present rather than being in denial. We're acknowledging this is what's true. This is how I feel. This is where I am. These are the choices someone else has made, or these are the choices that I have made. It's being grounded in reality in that regard. It's investing more energy in surrender rather than resistance. How much energy do we invest in resistance, right? And saying, no, this is not what I want, whatever it is that we have lost. And Richard Rohr says this so beautifully, moving from no to yes, trust and surrender, acknowledging that Trinity is in the business of generating life and light from all situations. Right, just let those words soak over you. That's what welcoming is. It's moving from no to yes. I heard him interviewed on Super Soul Sunday, maybe you saw that, and he said that it takes him about an hour each morning to move from no to yes. Isn't that great? I don't know about you, but I can have this default in me that's just no, right? No to surrendering to what is, or welcoming even. Learning learning to welcome what is true. One of the things that Richard Rohr also says in his book, Everything Belongs, is that everything belongs, not necessarily as it is, but brought into the light, educated and redeemed. Brought into the light, educated and redeemed. So what we're learning to welcome is whatever is true. Maybe we are feeling cynical about our work. Maybe we're sitting with a directee and we're feeling cynical about that. Or we're feeling apathetic, or we're feeling resistant. Maybe we're sitting with a beloved friend and we think, why am I checking out or feeling judgmental? Why am I having this no in me towards an adult child or towards my spouse that I love? One of the things that can be so beneficial for us is to be gentle, to stop and say, okay, this is what's true. So what is in this for me? Does this make sense? What is it that I am being drawn to pay attention to? Now, this is so important that we honor what happens if we don't do this, all right? When I move towards loss in particular with a posture of resistance, what happens in me is that my oldest and dearest defense mechanisms show up. Like I am pulled like a vacuum into whatever that may be, withdrawal, control, all those internal, maybe it's self-righteousness or cynicism. It could become outward behaviors where maybe I am pulled into binge watching, eating too much, sleeping too much, over-parenting, being over-spiritual, just checking out, being numb, those kinds of things. Does this make sense? If I don't want to welcome and surrender to what is true about me, about my situation, about my marriage, maybe it's about how I feel about God, whatever those things are, about a loss, then I am drawn into medicating that behavior. Now, for a moment here, I want to put on my other hat and just say I was talking at breakfast with Greg and Karen and Christina about this idea that at Faithful and True, we often have many ministers, missionaries come through all walks of life, all professions. But one of the things that I'm specifically aware of, and this is a lot of the clientele that you're servicing as a spiritual director, is folks in those roles in particular struggle, I think, more than any, welcoming what is, right? Because we've set people up to not feel that it can be safe to be vulnerable about what's really going on. So there's even a greater, oftentimes a greater resistance to this welcoming. So then, this is where we get into addictive behaviors. So, and we've seen these really increase in the pandemic, right? Whether it's drinking more or eating more or checking out through binge watching, those kinds of things. This is where we can experience and hear about addictive masturbation and pornography, addictive sex and marriage, and some other ways that our sexual health really begins to spiral out of control. What I want to give all of us the freedom to do is first to check that out with ourselves and to explore, is this a way that I am resisting welcoming what is? Is that showing up in my own sexual health or lack thereof? I also want to invite us into the freedom as you build credibility and trust with your directees. That this happens a lot, people will sort of lob something out there, right, to just see how we respond. And my encouragement is that we respond in kindness and grace as we are creating a space to hear what's really going on. Is this making sense? So many of the stories that I hear in this role at Faithful and True is of people who tried at some point to say, hey, can I tell you what's going on? And it was shut down or shamed, right? And by all accounts, these can be difficult, sometimes even awkward conversations. And yet, as we trace it back, it can be so much a part of what happens to us if we don't feel safe and invited to welcome what really is true. I want to pause here and just ask, how is this resonating with you? How is this landing?
You know, it reminds me some of, that thing that they call ambiguous grief.
Mm-hmm.
Or the kind of grief where you're carrying something of such enormous significance that those around you really are not, you wouldn't want them to know, or they may not accept it, or they may not understand it, and so it brings it back into this space, which is a very confined and alone space, which makes your grief heavier.
Yes.
Heavier, it compounds that sense of weight, and so how do I resonate with that? That's, shame is hiding. You pull in and you hide it. And
Absolutely.
that's just what's coming to mind.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. If you've read any of Kurt Thompson's work on shame, one of the things he says is that neurophysiologically, what we're learning is that shame hangs around longer in our bodies and our brains than any other emotion. We can move through any other emotion more quickly than we can shame. And shame, I think, is the culprit that often keeps us from acknowledging this is what is. This is what's true for me. Any other thoughts about this? Yeah.
I'm just struck with how important awareness of that spiritual bypass tactic is in all of this.
Yes.
Because we want to relieve people of their shame or relieve it in us. We don't want the feeling. And if offered the bypass, I'm not sure I've ever heard a sermon on forgiveness by a Christian preacher that did not tap into bypass as the payoff for forgiving. I can't think of one.
Yes.
I've certainly heard it spoken about at a retreat center,
Yeah.
or quite honestly by a woman, but I've never heard a man in the pulpit not tap somewhere into the notion of the bypass. But we can get you out of this feeling. We can get you free.
Yes.
This is what you need to do now.
Yes. Right. Which is the opposite of welcoming.
It's the opposite. It's a resistance tactic.
That's right. It's the resistance, not the trust.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Yeah. We are all prone to this, you guys. Thomas Keating says that we have our programs for happiness, right, that inevitably don't work. And so part of doing our own work as we then sit with other people is exploring what are my defense mechanisms, my ways that I reach to medicate, to exit, to check out when I don't want to welcome. And that is the very best, continuing ed, if you will, of how we sit with others, is that we're doing that internal work ourselves to check that out. So I want to teach you this morning a spiritual practice that was introduced to me several years ago by my dear friend and mentor, Cheryl Flesher. She was the first person that ever introduced me to spiritual direction, and it proved to be absolutely life-changing for me. And so to teach that, I want to tell you just this little piece that will be an important part of this practice. We're going to see if this will come back on. And all right, let's see. Okay, so to set up this spiritual practice, I want to teach you about something called the 7 desires of the heart. This is developed by my colleagues Mark and Debbie Laser, who founded Faithful and True. And of course, they didn't develop these desires themselves, but they put their heads together and created this construct that I find so, so helpful. The idea is that these are 7 desires that are common to men and women alike, and that these are all things that really drive our deepest longings, okay? So the first one here is being heard and understood, also defined as being seen and known. This is that deep, profound longing that even if you don't agree with me, you hear me, right? You see me, you understand what I'm saying. Years ago, when I left the church where I was on staff, as did my husband, we had to come up with our own insurance for a season. And that was back in the day that if you're self-employed, you understand chaotic insurance. But several years ago, there wasn't even preventative care. And so I sent my soon-to-be freshman to the doctor. You know, we took him to get his shots for high school and et cetera. And none of those were covered under our insurance. I got a $500 bill for his just, preventative vaccinations. And after many conversations with the insurance and the office, the bottom line was we had to pay it. And I finally said to the woman on the phone at the doctor's office, listen, can you just validate for me that this is crazy? Can you just tell me, oh, this does not make sense, that $500 should have to come out of your pocket? And she paused, she started laughing, she said, oh, absolutely, this is insane, I'm so sorry. And then I pulled out my credit card and paid my bill. I just needed somebody to say, hey, I see you. Vaccinations should be covered, right? And so wanting to be heard and understood and seen and known is one of our deepest desires. Another one is being affirmed. And this is where someone, again, it's a part of being seen. Someone says, hey, I see what a good job you did with that. Way to go. Way to go for how you showed up with this client. Or maybe your partner, your spouse says to you, I really love the way that you've taken care of this particular issue in our home, or navigated that delicate issue with one of our kids. It's specifically calling out something that you really did well. The next one, oh, we're going the wrong way, this way, is being blessed. Now, this is different from being affirmed. This isn't about something we do. This is about who we are. This is that sense deep within us that we know we are loved, period. If you're, a particular size in your body, you're loved. If you have a particular job or not, you're loved. If you show up in sarcasm or in graciousness, you're loved, right? This is that deep sense in us of that's our truest identity. And there's nothing that we could do to change that core truth that we are loved. That's what blessing is. If we've experienced blessing from our parents and caregivers, we are fortunate indeed. This is one of those things that I think many of us have come from situations where we did not experience this. Or maybe we saw it only, from one parent. But this is that deep, profound need in us to be blessed. This is being chosen. This is someone saying, hey, I choose you. And I chose this picture of these two friends. I love this because this so often comes out of who we were as children, right? Like being chosen for the team, right? Being chosen to spend the afternoon with a friend. I mean, these desires go back long and they're historic for us. But this is an important piece of one of our hardwired desires is to be chosen. This is to be included. And this is where someone says, hey, come be a part of this with us. We want you to be involved in our group. We want you to be at the table with the family, whatever that is. This can be our spouse saying to us, I want you to know and understand what's going on with me, right? I want to fill you in. I want you to hear what I've really been wrestling with. So it could be in a one-on-one conversation, it could be in a group, but it's someone saying, I want to involve you, right? I want you to have a seat at this table in my life, in this family, in this community, that kind of thing. All right, the next one is feeling safe. And this is such an important piece of our well-being. I mean, this is a part of Maslow's hierarchy, right? This is one of our primal needs. And this is, of course, physically safe, but it's also emotionally safe. One of the things that I'm aware of when, like after Christmas, when I am meeting with my clients, almost always I can count on, for the first couple of weeks after the holidays, multiple conversations around adult children who don't necessarily feel safe with their parents. There might be things where they feel like they have to, they're walking on eggshells, or they're afraid that a certain topic's going to come up, they're going to get zinged. Do you know those places and people in your life where you can just exhale? Right? You just simply feel safe. You trust that they have your well-being at heart, and you have that for them as well. We are hardwired to want to feel safe. And of course, there are people in our lives that we can, do some work and put some boundaries up in order to be with because we love them, they're part of our family, or, there are reasons that we want to be in those relationships. And this is a profound longing to be safe. And then finally is healthy touch. And healthy touch is, again, this idea that we are wired for connection physically. This is one of the real losses that we've experienced in these last 2 years, right? Particularly, I hear from folks who are single how challenging that's been, where they feel like, I haven't touched another person in a month. This is not how we're wired. And the chemicals that get released in our brain when we are in healthy touch with another person are powerful. The dopamine, the oxytocin, all of that is, again, a part of how God has created us. So, this is just a quick overview of these 7 desires, but do these make sense? That we are born with these innate longings to be heard and understood, to be affirmed, to be blessed, to be chosen, to be included, to be safe, to be safe, and to be touched. All right? Now, with that information in mind, I now want to walk us through this spiritual practice called the desire sequence. Let's see if that'll go off. Yeah. And the reason that I've chosen this specific practice for us this morning is because I believe it is such a tangible way for us to navigate welcoming what is. All right, so if somebody wouldn't mind turning the lights back on, that would be great. All right, I want you to think of this idea of sequence is really important to this practice. And I want you to think of this like going down, okay? Because there, as you see, there are these arrows. We move through these steps. If I could, I would have pasted these together for you in one long strip, all right? Because that's an important part of how this works. Okay, so the desire sequence is this framework through which we can navigate when we are, an important need is not being met, we sense a loss there, and we are resistant to welcoming what is. Does that make sense? All right, so we begin by naming the lesser desire. And the lesser desire here is only called, quote, lesser for lack of better language with it. It does not mean that it isn't important. So you can see that it might be something like, I want a friend to invite me to lunch, my spouse to ask me about my day, a day off, to receive flowers, a new couch. I mean, a host of things like that. Again, the idea is that we begin to acknowledge what desire is coming up in me, all right? If we can speak that desire and that desire is met, great, we celebrate that. If not, we keep moving through the sequence, all right? So, when the lesser desire is not met, we then can ask ourselves, okay, what's the greater desire going on here for me? This is where we keep centering down, right? And so this is where we start to ask ourselves, all right, is it a connected marriage, a more intimate friendship, a healthier rhythm or margin in my life? This is where the 7 desires come in, okay? This is such a helpful way to get underneath. When we start talking about desires, we know we are getting really more to the core of who we are. Are we wanting to be heard and understood? Are we wanting to be safe? Are we wanting to be included? Because see, if we stay up here above the waterline, you know what happens? We tend to make it somebody else's fault. They don't call. They don't respond in the way that I am longing for or that I need. Now, of course, it's not to say that other people can't make different choices and work on that, but we miss the knowing of ourselves, of what's really going on deeper within us. All right, so the desire that, say, our boss would notice our work may speak to our greater desire, right, to be affirmed. The desire to be invited to hang out with our friends may speak to our desire to be included. You see how this works, right? The desire for our spouse to be physically affectionate may speak to our desire to be touched in healthy ways, all right? We have to do this work, you guys, of what is this about for me? What's going on here for me? Now, we continue in the sequence. Then we ask, okay, so then what? And at this point, we have a few options. Emotionally healthy adults learn to name their needs, right? I don't know about you, but part of what I grew up believing in a more, evangelical setting was that anything that I would ask for would be selfish, right? I remember my youth minister writing on the chalkboard. It was an old youth house, right?
A what?
Right. Have any of you seen that acronym JOY written vertically? Jesus, others, you. And he said, that's how you have joy. And I was a good Christian girl, so I was like, got it. Jesus, others, then me, right? Well, the problem with that is that we don't learn to own what is in terms of our needs. Now, just because I have needs and I speak them doesn't mean that it's then the responsibility of those around me to always meet those needs. But part of what I've got to own as an emotional adult is that I have needs and that I can name what they are, okay? All right, so we begin to name those things, and we're going through the sequence. If those are met, we're grateful and we celebrate, right? But here's the place that most of us get stuck. All right, because again, this is a spiritual practice for what happens when we're resistant to welcoming what is. All right, right here, instead of continuing down, we go horizontal, right? This is the place where right here we start to camp out and we get stuck. We feel hurt, we feel resentful, we feel unchosen, we feel unseen. You can see the list. We get victim-y. We begin to feel cynicism or bitterness or isolation or shame, withdrawal. What's wrong with me that she or he won't meet my desires? Or blame, what's wrong with them that they won't meet my desires, right? This is where addictions can show up as a way to numb and medicate if these aren't getting met, okay? And then additionally, another piece of this is that our survivor, our false self, begins to take over, right? We don't bring our emotional adult online here, typically. This is where we leak out sideways. And right here, you guys, is usually where we stop. Right here may be the place that we will ourselves and we say things like, stop it. Stop it. You're being ridiculous. This is not okay. This is not what a mature person does. Get back in the game. And so then we return back up to the relationship with these unsettled, unwelcomed pieces in us. Is this making sense, right? And we've not navigated welcoming. We've not done any work to acknowledge the loss that's happening here, and we get stuck. Chances are we've all done that, and we've been in relationships with people who have done that. And you can feel the energy off of them where they're like prickly, right? Or maybe it's fine and then there's a zing. Like, whew, what is that coming at me, right? Here's the other option. At this point, if we choose the practice, the next level is grieving. Grieving, of course, is when we lose a loved one. Grieving is also when we don't feel seen. We don't feel blessed. We don't feel safe. We don't feel chosen. And this is where it is the road less traveled. And we grieve what was taken from us or what wasn't given to us or how someone couldn't show up, right? This is when we, like we were saying last night, we believe that we'll get stuck here. And I believe we are created with the capacity to do this if we are finding healthy handrails in these hallways to do it. All right, so we only have so much emotional space. And so in order to navigate kind of letting go some of the irritation or hurt or cynicism or bitterness, we begin to sink into our grief. This is where we journey with it, right? This is where we acknowledge, I don't like this, I'm feeling, and then I'm mad about, I'm sad about. This is what this has cost me. Is this making sense? Then we stay in the sequence. The next part of the practice is that we center down into our deepest desires. Now, this is not dissimilar to the 7 desires, but this is where we rest in God. This is where we are saying, as the welcoming prayer says, divine therapist, I welcome your action and your presence into this place that I'm in.
Divine, what was it?
Therapist. That's Thomas Keating's language, yes, divine therapist. And it's so important that in this place, we learn to rest in undefended vulnerability with God. This is where we are resting in undefended vulnerability with God. Right? One of the things that I imagine, I know this is true for me, and I imagine is true for many of us, is that when I am allowing myself to rest and invite God to meet my deepest desires, to whisper the truths, these holy truths, that I am chosen, that I am seen, that I am affirmed, that I am loved, right? What happens in that place is that I return to my factory setting, so to speak. I rest in the truth that I am beloved. No matter what someone else hasn't been able to do or what thing has happened, right, or not happened that I needed, I allowed God to meet me in my greatest desires. Now, thankfully, there's one more step in the sequence. This is the place, if I were drawing this line, we come back up into relationship at this point. Right? We've been doing our work. We've been allowing God to meet us. We've been welcoming what is. And so then I return to friendship or relationship, able to be at peace within myself. Now, that doesn't mean that I stay in a relationship where my needs are never met, okay? Like, we have to have nuance with this. That may mean that I have some hard choices to make if I'm in a relationship where my needs are rarely, if ever, met. But it does mean that I have welcomed what is, and I am returning after having sat in undefended vulnerability with God. Is this making sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right, I want to check out here. What questions do you have about this? Or how is this landing with you? Yeah, Sally.
So, I was wondering where you were going to take us back to, because I think the tendency is to do all this inner work,
Yeah.
but then not let it become outer work.
Yes. Yes.
And so the action that happens out of this it's very different than the action that would happen if we didn't do this.
Yes.
But it's so, and sometimes the very same things are wanted, but they're approached differently.
Absolutely.
So I think that's important to put an underline around, because the tendency is to then not act, like have all this
Right.
awareness inside, but not bring it out.
Yes.
Because bringing it out is going to cause some rift.
Yes.
It could,
It well could.
but it's not done to do rift, it's done in peace. And so.
That's right. And there's a much better chance that I'm coming at this from my emotional adult, right? Like, I'm not coming at this, hopefully, as much from my false self or survivor self, as I like to call it. I am instead am coming from a more grounded place. And then I can show up in relationships and own, and boy, is this an emotional adult characteristic. I can own, hey, I'm aware that I have a longing to be safe around this thing. And this particular issue doesn't feel safe, right? It's a very different kind of conversation, but that's such a good connection. Yes, we do the inner work so that we can come back into relationship. Yeah. Yeah.
I love the phrase of the factory setting of belonging, because beloved, because, you know, what I most experience with others is they are not aware of that factory setting.
Yeah.
They're not aware that that's the default.
Yeah.
And to hit the reset button, they don't realize they can do that.
Yeah.
And so I deeply appreciate that concept, that in some ways that's where we have to start. And that's where the those seven desires are. That's
Yeah.
the factory setting.
That is. That's the factory setting. Yes.
And so in this world of narcissism, and in this world of adversarial relationships, how do we teach the factory setting?
Mm.
You know,
Well, I think this is where we have to experience this, right? It is regular, like it's sinking in, right? It's centering down. It's allowing God to say to us, I see you. I choose you. You are my beloved. And I think it's more caught than taught even.
Yes.
Yeah,
I was just gonna
Rox.
say, I mean, and I don't think that's a quick thing. That's what that
No.
stuff isn't like, okay, good, got it, and move
Right.
back up. I think you gotta spend some time there and let that rewiring and
Yes.
flooding of sense of belonging fill you until it
Yeah.
starts to change.
Yeah.
And it's very cyclical, you're gonna have to, like, you're taking laps.
Oh, yeah, yeah. The desire sequence is a sequence that hopefully we are engaging multiple times, right? I'm going to give us some time now to just sit with this, all right? And I want to encourage that you spread out in the room. If you want, you can stay right where you are. There's lots of chairs we can move around and so forth. But we're going to take a good 20 minutes or so here. And there's some questions to help you process it. And my encouragement is that you think of a need or a loss that you were longing for that was not met. You guys take care not to minimize, like, oh, that was kind of silly. That wasn't much. There is almost always something deeper, right? If it stayed with you, if it came to mind, chances are there's a deeper desire underneath it, okay? And then we'll come back in just a little bit. But let's take about 20 minutes or so here, okay? I'm just going to play some music and let you have some space with it.